now we're going to cross to Nick McGuigan and Thomas Kern. So Nick and Thomas are co-instigators of something called the Accountability Institute. So the Accountability Institute is interesting because it kind of does what we're trying to do here, in that it kind of, what does it do?
Brings together economists,
technology,
science and artists to look at new ways of doing economy.
Yeah.
Or accountants, sorry, not economists. Nick and Thomas are, you know, they're amazing communicators, and you know, they lecture and work at Monash, and they run they queer accounting. It's one of their kind of, you know, famous things that they're kind of on about. And why is that important? You know, like where the queer theory kind of aspect of, you know, what we're kind of talking about. We talked a bit before about, you know, experimentation and creativity. And for me, that is, you know, another way of actually understanding that is through queering, you know? Totally.
And having we talked about it in the beginning, to use Conroy's words again, it's a non-binary kind of approach to the economy.
Yeah, it's not fixed, right? So, you know, like these things can change. Now, in capital, things can change too, but often those things that are changing, we're just having to consume them because those changes are happening at another level that we don't have access to. And the kind of, you know, the profits, the good things that are coming from that kind of labour and that change is flowing up to people who are accumulating it. And it's, yeah, obviously that's something which doesn't really benefit the world. It doesn't benefit all of us.
No, definitely not.
So we're having to continue to talk a little bit longer because I think we're having technical situation.
No, we're going to throw to it.
We're ready for Thomas and Nick. Welcome.
Hello.
Having us. We too would like to acknowledge the people of the Kulin Nations on the lands in which we are gathered here today. We pay our respects to the elders past, present and emerging. So hey everyone, I'm Nick.
And I'm Thomas.
And we're part of the Accountability Institute, which is really looking at trying to bring art, science, economics and technology together and kind of have conversations around accounting and accountability. So we're kind of both accountants. We apologize.
Sorry for that.
But we've been asked to come in and do a little bit of how we account or the accounts, how we're going to cost out this UBI system. So we're just going to throw to our presentation slides.
Okay. So we have heard so many great reasons for UBI, and actually Loriana and Craig did such an amazing job. I don't want to repeat it all, and they could do that in a much better way than we could do that as accountants. We love to talk in numbers, which we'll get to in a minute. Sorry for that. But so that's what we love. But anyway, so here you can see on that slide again, very good reasons for a UBI. Yeah, for example, the first one here, automation, the end of work. That's a very important one. So even if you don't grab the concept or grasp the concept of UBI, we are, from an economic point of view, humankind and our societies are forced to change something about how wealth is distributed. So we necessarily need to get away from attaching it to employed work. Yeah? So that's the consequence, the necessary consequence from automation. Yeah? And I don't want to go into all of those great reasons. Maybe you would like to, in the Q&A part, to ask questions about some of those. And I know some of those are probably a bit critical or not to your liking necessarily. So if I think about, for example, economic growth, that of course contradicts what we need to do, where we need to hit to in terms of environmental sustainability. Yeah. So many people say UBI is good for economic growth because it redistributes income to those who would spend it, and that would be increased consumption. Of course, that has environmental consequences. Yeah? So what has a good side can also have a negative side of all of this. Yeah? So I'd like to go into the question, so why is it when we have such good reasons, as we have already heard, for UBI, why don't we have one already? Yeah? And it's binary, like all good accounting equations, it's binary. So we want to ask two questions. Firstly, can we afford it? And secondly, are we there yet? Yeah. So the first one comes from the biggest argument against UBI. You can hear from governments usually, and also from business circles, and more the right-leaning people, if you like, the market people who believe in markets. And they say we can't afford it. And then the second reason might actually lay within us ourselves. Am I ready for it? And that will be the second part, what we would like to talk about. So, can we afford it? And that depends on, if we want to think about that question, that depends, of course, on the model or the scale of the UBI you are thinking of. And we have different models at hand, which were discussed since decades, actually. So it could come through what is called a negative income tax, which tops up actually income to a certain threshold, which could be, for example, the poverty line, or it could be any other threshold above the poverty line. And it is integrated into the tax system, obviously. So either if you earn more than a certain threshold, you would pay tax to the government, or if you are below a certain threshold, that would be topped up, your income would be topped up to a certain threshold. The second one, and that is actually probably what we in a more narrow sense understand under UBI, is the demo grant. So it's a grant, an unconditional grant, and Oriana and Craig also talked about this already. Unconditional and somewhat universal. Also, there are slight differences between the two, as we have learned from Craig. So a grant based on purely demographics, yeah? But in our case, when we talk in a narrow sense about universal income, we would actually grant any member of society that grant and that universal basic income. So that would be an amount that is provided to every citizen within a society. The third model that touches on basic income is a so-called universal dividend, and it pays a dividend or a rent out of common wealth, such as land, natural resources, to every citizen. So it's the participation in the common wealth or the common property of a society or a nation. And we also have some examples globally. So for example, in Norway or in Alaska, where citizens are or take part in the rent of common goods, and especially land or natural resources. Unfortunately, in the case of Alaska, it's oil actually where the rent is based on, which involves a whole lot of other difficulties and things to discuss, but we don't go there at the moment. So just to give you an idea, what models, what practical solutions are there actually around UBI? Yeah? So, and then it comes to the actual affordability. So can the government, and if we actually base our discussion on the assumption that it is public money that we are using for it, and maybe our discussion tonight will also lead into areas where it doesn't have to be necessarily public money, but it can also be private money. We might discuss this a bit later. But if we work on this assumption that the government provides this UBI in whatever form, and when we then talk about affordability, we need to talk about how is it financed from the government. Yeah? And so there is many forms to finance such a UBI. For example, one part that could contribute to the financing is the savings from other welfare payments and their associated bureaucracy. And that's also an argument that is brought into the discussion very often from people supporting UBI, that we actually save a lot of bureaucracy, which is attached to the current welfare system. Yeah? And then the other major part would be through taxation, which could then take many forms. So for example, we could increase the income or corporate tax rate to finance it. Of course, we could close tax loopholes. We could remove subsidies and tax exemptions. Probably all of us remember the discussion just before the last election here in Australia about a negative hearing and the capital gain rebate, which Labour wanted to abolish. And so that would bring in, of course, more income for the government that could then be spent, for example, on UBI. We could increase GST, and there's many models around in the world, and discuss where we would actually finance it, at least partly, through the taxation of consumption, which GST, of course, is. Yeah? We could introduce a carbon tax, for example, and actually address two problems at the same time. We could bring down carbon emissions, which we need to do. We need to address climate change necessarily. And we could use that carbon tax actually to also fight income equality and to get to all the advantages we have discussed before. Or the last item here on that list, which is of course not exhaustive. I just wanted to give you a glimpse about what is possible, what can we discuss. The last thing is economic rents on land and natural resources, and that relates directly to the universal dividend model I showed you just a slide before. And some people say that would be a tax, and therefore it's here under tax, but other people say that's actually not a form of taxation and would put it as a separate item. But again, I don't want to spend too much time on such details. So to finish up my part, and then Nick will be taking over the more sophisticated, more philosophical parts, because I'm more the number guy. I just wanted to introduce you to two modeling examples, which we found and which were done for the Australian context. So I apologize to any international audience, but that's just examples for Australia, how we could go about financing those things. And for example, Ben Phillips from the ANU, for example, did a modeling for a scheme that would give Australians, every Australian citizens benefits equal to the age pension. So that would be around $23,000 per annum for singles or $34,800 for couples. I'm not sure if that might have changed in the meantime. So that was back in 2018. That might have increased slightly, but anyway. So that would be roughly, so also that you have an idea what would be the benefit for every individual citizen. So that would mean, which is quite interesting, also to give you an idea in terms of numbers, welfare payments would rise from currently 123 billion to 378 billion if we would do that. So plus over 250 billion more. And if it was financed by income tax, so by an increase of the rates, which was the assumption of Ben Phillips, that would mean we had to increase the rates by 33 percentage points. So we would have marginal tax rates starting from 33% up to 78%. And that might sound shocking for some, because we are not used to those rates anymore after all the neoliberal years we have gone through. But actually such tax rates were common before. So it's not something that is totally out of place. We had such rates in the US, interestingly. We had such rates in Sweden, for example. And those economies we know worked very well under those tax rates. So it is feasible, yeah? And just one other modeling to wrap up. If I can move the slides, yeah, no, I can. So that was a little of a study of Gary Floman-Hoff, which is with the University of Queensland. So, and he calculated a rent from land, natural resources, and other commonwealth, like licenses, government monopolies, for example, like gambling and stuff, which of course includes critical stuff as well again, and we need to talk about the details certainly. But anyway, he added also a carbon tax and minus any existing government revenues from these sources. So he was calculating the additional government income through such a rent on land, natural resources, and those other commonwealths. Yeah? And he came up, and that was 2017, with an amount of 289 billion of additional government income, which could be used, for example, if we divide it by the 24 million or so citizens in Australia, they would get $12,000 per year as a UBI. So that is even more the amount, more than was needed for the age pension model I showed you just a slide before. So again, this is not unrealistic, and we have become used to such numbers, especially in recent weeks, when we just throw out the government billions of dollars, like 130 billion first for the JobKeeper model, which then turned out to be only 70 billion. But anyway, as you can see, there is room for playing and for experimenting actually with UBI. But I leave you with that, enough numbers, and I pass on to my better half.
Thanks so much, Thomas. So the second part of the kind of what we were trying to unbreak or break down was asking the question, are we there yet? And I really like this image because for us, it represents essentially our relationship with money. How we would do anything for money, how we work and we identify both by earning money and also the work in which we do to get that money. And it's kind of really embedded into the way we think about ourselves and the way we interact and the way we live. We put our trust in that kind of dollar value, if you like, rather than necessarily the trust in each other or in human interaction. And so that's kind of gone really deep into the way we're thinking about ourselves as individuals. There's no such thing as a free lunch, for example. In business schools, we often talk about competition, and that being competitive in business is really good because we've got to be able to win that dollar and obviously generate a profit. And so I'm kind of curious about unpacking that, because we need to think about a way in which we can unlearn some of quite a lot of those inherent things that we educate inside business schools, absolutely. So we need a way to build up some of our rethinking around those current societal values and how that might happen in recent times. And of course, in recent times, we've seen that happen. So we've seen that happen recently in Australia when we were able to achieve marriage equality. And what would be the marriage equality movement, if you like, for UBI, for example? And of course, that wasn't easy. One, that took a lot of resources and it took a lot of strategic integration of a number of different key players inside organizations, but also external to organizations as well. And so I kind of think about what is the role that art plays in disrupting some of our values through time. So if we think about social change always occurs when all of these things interact and integrate, etc. And I'm kind of, when I think about art, I kind of think initially to Ryan Presley's work. Ryan Presley, an Indigenous artist, his recent work called Blood Money is just fascinating. He uses the symbol, or the infinity symbol, which I found really interesting when you put the infinity symbol on a dollar value. Because in this way, he's talking about the kind of recurring, iterative circulation of money. And the value that money has is circulating through a community all the time in infinite ways. Just going around and around and around a community with an infinite value. And so I'm really interested, and we're really interested about how art can play a role in disrupting some of what you're seeing on the screen at the moment. The idea that this kind of ways of thinking, this fluid way of thinking outside the binary needs to happen inside the education, within government agencies, within professional accounting bodies, for example, within our business schools and the way we educate. Our education needs to be much less binary. It needs to be much less about debits and credits, for example, and look at the fluid nature of accounting and accountability and kind of design an accounting system around an ecological systems design, for example. So really interested about the role that art plays in that context. And it's not just, and sorry, I also wanted to say, we've got so few artists working inside some of these mainstream organizations. It would be amazing to think about what art could be doing inside those spaces. And that's why we created the world's first artist in residence program here at the business school, specifically in accounting, where we create a space for artists to come and join us as an accounting department to rethink some of the ways we practice our accountants and the way we educate as well. But if we think about social change, a lot of the first two we're seeing is happening at a much higher kind of strategic global level, if you like. The idea of starting to translate some of these ideas in any medium we can to engage with artists to be able to translate those ideas into different mediums would be really helpful from our side in business schools to try and disrupt and actually kind of integrate some of those resources into the way we're educating. It'll change the mindset of often those gatekeepers toward that environment, and also how we can infiltrate that mainstream. So those two things really strategic at a kind of global systems focused level. But then I kind of wanted to end our presentation by talking about the local level, because why can't we start a UBI right now? Why can't we engage in UBI principles and actually start it happening right now? So when we engage with our community gardens and we go down to the community garden, we're all about the kind of resources that we have and the individuals that have those land resources to be able to grow food. But if we've got too much food, if we've grown too much, then this is an idea of surplus that we can't use. We're naturally there to gift that food to other people, those resources within that small localized community. So if you think about the way a community garden works, why couldn't we start to create a community wage commoning, if you like? and start to think about where geographically we might create those boundaries. Maybe it's sharing our community, our wages across one of our roads, for example, with the houses on it. We start to collectively pull our waging, and then we start to common and create that idea of universal basic income right from now. Why can't we start at this point in time? And so we're going to leave it there, and then we can pick up on any Q&As later. Thank you so much.
Thank you. That was amazing. That was a really good overview.
Thank you very much.
Of the situation from a accountability perspective. I think that that really speaks to the way you kind of left us there in regards to how can we do this now, on a micro level. How can we actually start looking at the commons, and our approach to relationality on an everyday life is really, really important. And I just wanted to bring up something else actually that one of our agitators actually put forward in the chat just now, Vivian Gerard, that UBI is actually not new to potential policy in Australia. It was actually very seriously being considered by the Whitlam government in the 70s as a way to reduce and remove poverty from the country. And it was really just, it went with the dismissal. So Vivian will ask more questions and kind of talk to that a bit more later. But I think that that's important when we're thinking about feasibility, which I really feel like Nick and Thomas nailed. It totally sounds feasible and viable. Yeah,
well, I guess what they really highlighted was that there's so many different options, there's so many different ways that we could kind of implement one. It's not one UBI for all, I suppose.
Yeah, that's right. And it's something which I guess, needs to adapt to local situation, and, over time, if that's how we think we want to be living as people, then, we scale it up, and then we start looking at how it works across nations and how it works across the globe, etc. So, but it has a different face according to its location. Stop